The infiltration. The air inside the Zorvath throne chamber was thick and humid. The walls, made of dark metal, pulsed with strange green lights. The smell of burning fuel mixed with something rotten. It was the scent of war and death. Captain Elias Carter stood in the center of the room, his hands tied behind his back with thick metal restraints. His body ached from days of beatings, but his mind was clear. He was not alone. Beside him, a small girl clung to his leg. Lena, no more than 6 years old, trembled but did not cry. Her wide brown eyes stared up at the massive figure in front of them, the Zorvath Queen. Queen Slithera stood tall on her throne, her long, insect-like arms resting on the armrests of her seat. Her dark, scaled skin shimmered under the dim lights. Her golden eyes gleamed with cruelty. She looked down at Carter and Lena the way a predator looks at wounded prey. "You humans are weak," she said, her voice a sharp hiss. "You fight, you resist, but in the end, you all kneel." Carter said nothing. His face was bruised, his lips split, but he only stared at her with cold, steady eyes. The Queen leaned forward, studying him. "I have crushed your people. Your soldiers die screaming. Your cities burn. And yet," she narrowed her eyes, "you smile." Carter's lips curled slightly. It was barely a smile, but it was enough to make the Queen frown. Lena clutched his leg tighter. "Captain," she whispered. "Sheh, kid," Carter said softly. His voice was calm, even as he felt the cold metal of a Zorvath blade press against his back. The guards were restless. The Queen was getting impatient. She rose from her throne, stepping closer. Her long claws tapped against the floor as she circled him. "I know your kind," she continued. "You believe in foolish things. Hope, strength, love, lies you tell yourselves before you die." She knelt beside Lena, reaching out a clawed hand. The girl flinched. Carter pulled slightly against his restraints, but the Zorvath guard behind him twisted the blade deeper against his spine. "Touch her," he warned, "and I'll make you regret it." The Queen laughed. It was a horrible, dry sound. "Regret? You think you can threaten me?" She straightened up and turned to her warriors. "Prepare the execution," she ordered. "Kill the soldier first. Let the child watch." The Zorvath guards moved instantly, dragging Carter toward a metal platform. Chains clanked as a massive energy weapon powered up overhead. A bright red light bathed the room. The execution chamber was ready. Lena gasped and tried to follow, but a Zorvath soldier grabbed her by the arm, pulling her back. "No," she cried. Carter didn't struggle. He didn't fight. Not yet. Instead, he whispered something under his breath. The Queen smirked. "Praying human." Carter exhaled slowly. Something like that. Then the lights flickered. A low, rumbling hum filled the room. It was deep, unnatural, like the sound of something waking up. The floor trembled. The Queen's smile faded. "What is that?" A second hum followed, louder this time. The walls vibrated. Somewhere in the distance, an explosion echoed. The Zorvath warriors shifted uneasily, gripping their weapons. Carter tilted his head. "Funny thing about humans," he said. "We don't fight fair." Another explosion rocked the palace. The green lights in the walls flickered again. This time, they didn't turn back on. The chamber was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the execution weapon overhead. The Queen hissed in fury. "Status report," she snapped. A Zorvath technician stumbled forward, his voice panicked. "My Queen, there's a..." A third explosion cut him off. This time, it was much closer. The guards turned toward the entrance, weapons raised. Carter smiled wider. The Queen spun toward him, eyes burning with rage. "What have you done?" Carter shrugged. "I told you. You shouldn't have taken the wrong people." The ceiling groaned. A deep mechanical voice echoed through the palace speakers. Human presence detected. Initiating countermeasures. Then, with a deafening crack, the entire palace began to shake. Lena squeezed her eyes shut, pressing against Carter's leg. The Queen's golden eyes widened. "Impossible," she whispered. Carter looked at her, his voice calm, almost amused. "You thought we were weak. You thought we would kneel." He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming in the red execution light. "Big mistake." Outside, the night sky erupted with fire. The human fleet had arrived. The Queen's cruelty. The walls of the Zorvath execution chamber trembled as distant explosions echoed through the fortress. Alarms blared in the alien tongue, but Captain Elias Carter remained still, his hands still bound behind him, his expression unreadable. The Queen, Slithera, was no fool. She had ruled the Zorvath Empire for over a century, crushing species far more advanced than these fragile, fleshy humans. And yet, something about Carter unsettled her. "You planned this," she hissed, golden eyes narrowing. "Somehow you knew." Carter smiled slightly. "I guessed." The Queen snarled. Her claws flexed, her patience fraying. "Do you know what I do to creatures who defy me, human?" she asked. "I break them. Slowly, piece by piece, until they forget what it means to be free." Lena, the small child clinging to Carter's side, whimpered but did not cry. She had seen too much already. Carter shifted slightly, placing himself between her and the Queen. Slithera tilted her head, watching them. A slow, cruel smile spread across her lips. "Ah, now I see," she whispered. "This little one, she is why you are still standing. A human child's innocence is like armor, isn't it? A reason to fight, a reason to endure." She turned away, waving a clawed hand. The execution weapon hummed louder, the energy crackling in the air. "Strip him of that armor," she commanded. A Zorvath soldier seized Lena by the arm, yanking her away from Carter. The child struggled, her tiny hands clawing at the thick, scaly fingers. "No, let go," she screamed. Carter's smile vanished. His body tensed, his breath slow and measured. He did not yell. He did not struggle. But his eyes burned. The Queen leaned close, whispering near his ear. "You have two choices, human. Fight for your life in my arena, and the girl will serve my empire until she forgets your name. Or," she ran a claw gently across his throat, "die now, and she joins you." Lena gasped, eyes wide with terror. "No, Captain." Carter's jaw clenched, but his voice remained even. "And if I win in the arena?" Slithera chuckled, stepping back. "Humans always hope, don't they? But let's pretend you do. Then I will allow the child to live. As a slave. At least she will breathe. But you will die. Eventually." The silence stretched between them. Carter stood still, his expression like stone. Then he laughed. It was soft at first, a low, almost amused chuckle. It was not the sound of a broken man. Slithera's amusement faltered. "What is so funny, human?" Carter looked at her, his blue eyes bright, as if he saw something she didn't. "You've already lost." The Queen's eyes flickered with confusion. But before she could speak, the fortress shook violently. This time, not from a distant explosion, but from inside the walls. The alarms changed tone, no longer warning of an outside attack, but of something worse. Something unexpected. The Zorvath soldier holding Lena turned, distracted. The child didn't waste a second. She bit down hard on the alien's hand. The warrior hissed, loosening his grip just enough. Lena slipped free and ran back to Carter. The execution platform's red glow flickered, then died. The energy weapon's hum stuttered and stopped. "Impossible," the Queen whispered. Carter exhaled through his nose. Amused. "Told you." Suddenly, the chamber doors exploded inward. A dark, horrific shape lunged into the room. A Zorvath soldier, its carapace shattered, its eyes wild with panic. It wasn't attacking. It was running. "Something's in the walls." The wounded warrior shrieked. It's not human. It's a blur of motion. A dark, coiling shadow ripped the Zorvath's head clean off, dragging the twitching body back into the darkness beyond the doorway. Silence. The queen froze. For the first time, a flicker of fear crossed her face. She turned slowly back to Carter. What have you done?" Carter rolled his shoulders, stretching his neck. The bindings on his wrists snapped open with a quiet click. He had never been restrained. Not really. He reached down, gripping Lena's hand in his own. "I gave you a chance," he said simply. "You wasted it." A guttural growl echoed through the halls. The lights flickered wildly, the green glow pulsing like a heartbeat. Then the screaming began, the unexpected threat. The fortress trembled like a dying beast, its metal walls groaning under unseen pressure. The eerie green lights flickered wildly, casting jagged shadows that danced like ghosts. The screaming beyond the throne room hadn't stopped. If anything, it was growing louder. Queen Slithera stood rigid, her golden eyes darting toward the darkened hallway, where her warrior had just been dragged away. The Zorvath were not a species that feared much. They were the apex predators of their sector, conquerors of worlds. But right now, something cold and unfamiliar coiled in her gut. It was fear. She turned sharply to Carter, who knelt beside the child, Lena, whispering something to her. His restraints lay in broken pieces at his feet, as if they had never really held him at all. Slithera's claws curled into fists. What was this human? Her guards were tense, weapons raised toward the darkness. The fortress alarms continued to wail, switching to an urgent new tone, one she had never heard before. Then the voice spoke. A deep guttural sound, layered with static, crawled through the chamber speakers. It wasn't Zorvath. It wasn't human. "Queen Slithera, your dominion ends tonight." The queen's breath caught. No one had ever spoken to her like that. She hissed, spinning toward the control panel. "Who dares?" The lights cut out completely. Darkness swallowed the room. The only sound was the hum of energy weapons being primed by her warriors. Then something dripped. A slow, wet pattering from above. One of her guards shifted uneasily. Then another. Something was on the ceiling. "Fire!" The queen shrieked. The Zorvath warriors unleashed a storm of plasma rounds toward the darkness above. The flashes of green energy lit up the horror for mere seconds, just enough time for them to see. It was not human. A twisting, black shape, many-limbed, its surface shimmering and shifting like living ink. No eyes, no mouth, just hunger. And it moved fast. The first Zorvath warrior had no time to scream as it dropped from the ceiling, its dark mass folding over him like liquid shadow. He was simply gone, his weapon clattering to the floor, still smoking from his last shot. Panic seized the room. "Hold your ground," the queen ordered, but her voice cracked. It didn't matter. The darkness was alive, and it was hunting them. Carter, still kneeling beside Lena, exhaled slowly. "Took you long enough," he murmured. The queen's head snapped toward him. He knew. Her golden eyes narrowed. "You brought this thing." Carter stood up, cracking his knuckles. "I didn't bring it." He turned toward the shifting shadows, his voice calm. "It followed me." The queen's mind reeled. The Zorvath had fought countless species. None had creatures like this. "You are lying," she snarled. "This is a trick." Carter smiled, but it wasn't comforting. "You wanted to see what makes humans dangerous, didn't you?" He stepped forward, unafraid of the shifting mass in the room. Lena clung to his leg, watching the darkness with wide eyes. But she wasn't crying. She was listening. The creature shifted, its amorphous form coiling, folding inward, and then, impossibly, it spoke again. "We have been patient. We have been watching. Now, it begins." The queen's claws trembled. She had thought she understood humanity. She had thought them weak, predictable. But this was something else. She took a step back. The creature laughed, a horrible echoing sound. It wasn't just inside the throne room. It was coming from every speaker in the fortress. Then, with a deafening metal shriek, the walls began to crack open, and something else started coming through. The truth about Lena. The walls of the Zorveth fortress shuddered under the weight of something ancient, something unseen. Queen Slithera stood frozen, her golden eyes darting between the shifting black mass in the chamber and the unbroken expression on Captain Elias Carter's face. The air itself felt heavy, charged with a tension she could not control. She had ruled an empire for over a century, crushed civilizations beneath her feet, and yet she did not understand what was happening. The darkness did not move like any creature she had ever seen. It flowed, coiling around the chamber like a sentient storm, stretching across the walls in an unnatural ripple. And the sound, it spoke, but not in words. It was something deeper, something that bypassed the ears and whispered directly into the mind. You feared the wrong thing, Queen of Ash. Slithera flinched, her talons curling involuntarily. Her guards were still firing, but the plasma bolts did nothing, vanishing into the blackness like stones sinking into an endless ocean. The creature absorbed them, growing stronger with every failed attack. The Zorvath warriors, battle-hardened and without mercy, were breaking. But Carter simply stood there, unshaken. Slithera's mind raced. How was he so calm? Humans were supposed to panic in the face of death. They were supposed to beg. And yet he watched as her warriors were consumed by the dark, his gaze cool, steady, like a man watching a storm roll in, knowing there was no stopping it. Then something changed. The darkness paused. It hesitated, just for a moment, and then turned toward Lena. Slithera's breath caught. The child had not moved. She stood beside Carter, her small hands clenched into fists, her wide brown eyes locked onto the swirling mass of shadows. And she was glowing. A faint light, pulsing from within her tiny frame, flickered against the darkness. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable against the deep void, but then it grew, soft, golden, and pulsing like a heartbeat. Slithera's eyes widened. The creature, the thing in the walls, hesitated. And then it spoke again, this time in a voice that almost sounded reverent. We were waiting for you. Lena took a step forward. The child, so small, so fragile-looking, faced the darkness as though she had seen it before. She tilted her head, listening. Carter knelt beside her, resting a steadying hand on her shoulder. Easy, kid, he murmured. Remember what we talked about. Lena nodded. The golden glow surrounding her intensified. It pulsed outward, pushing back the dark. The shifting mass recoiled slightly, as if touched by something it could not withstand. Slithera watched, stunned. This wasn't some strange technology. This wasn't some hidden human weapon. This child was something else entirely. And then Carter looked at her, his blue eyes gleaming under the golden light. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the chamber like the calm before a storm. You took the wrong child. Slithera's mind reeled. This wasn't possible. The Zorvath had taken thousands of human prisoners over the years, soldiers, rebels, civilians. None of them had ever shown power like this. None of them had ever glowed like a dying star. What is she? The queen hissed, stepping back, her voice barely above a whisper. Carter's gaze did not waver. She's your mistake. The queen's lips curled back in a snarl. I don't believe in human myths. You are nothing. Your people are nothing. Carter's expression darkened. You still don't get it, do you? He shook his head. You invaded Earth. You burned our cities. You thought we were weak. He glanced at Lena, the warm golden light reflecting in his eyes. But humanity doesn't just fight wars with weapons. The Zorvath had studied humans for decades. They had documented their endurance, their adaptability, their stubborn refusal to die. But there was one thing they had never understood. One thing no species in the galaxy could quantify. Humanity evolved in defiance. Through ice ages, plagues, wars, and the brink of extinction, they had survived not because they were strong, but because they were relentless. Hope was not a weakness. It was their greatest weapon. And now, Lena was proof of something more. Carter's voice was steady, quiet, but it rang through the throne room like a battle hymn. You think we're just another species to conquer? He took a step forward, and Lena's light pushed back the dark. You think we're prey? Slithera clenched her fists, stepping back. No, this wasn't right. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. But you never asked what happens, Carter continued, when humans stop running. Lena lifted her small hand. The fortress shook violently, but this time it was not from an attack outside. It was Lena. The golden glow spread, weaving through the walls like roots digging into the heart of the structure. The creature in the darkness whispered again, but this time it sounded afraid. She is not ready. Lena turned toward it, her expression calm. Then help me, she said softly. Slithera's blood turned to ice. This wasn't just a human child. This wasn't just a mistake. This was something else. Something new. Something she did not understand, and for the first time in her long, merciless reign, Queen Slithera felt the icy grip of true dread. The fortress's walls began to crack open, and something ancient answered Lena's call. The human secret weapon. The walls of the Zorveth fortress groaned, as if something deep within them had awakened. The green alien glow that had pulsed through the structure flickered erratically, struggling against the golden radiance that now poured from Lena like a living sun. The swirling black entity that had once whispered through the corridors now hesitated, its form pulling back, uncertain. And Queen Slithera, ruler of the most feared empire in the sector, the executioner of worlds, the breaker of species, felt something foreign slithering through her veins. Helplessness. It wasn't possible. The Zorveth did not fear humans. They crushed them. They burned their colonies, slaughtered their soldiers, reduced their resistance to dust. But now, everything had changed. Carter stepped forward, his expression calm as he placed a hand on Lena's shoulder. The glow around her pulsed stronger, stretching outward, tendrils of golden light creeping into the walls. The fortress itself reacted, like a living thing feeling its first heartbeat. Slithera bared her fangs. Enough, she snarled. This is a trick. She turned to her remaining warriors, their numbers dwindling. Kill them. The Zorveth guards hesitated. Not out of disobedience, not out of weakness. They hesitated because they could feel it too. The air had changed. It was thicker, heavier. Something beyond words pressed into their skulls, deep into their bones. A presence, a force that should not exist. It was coming from the child, and it was growing. Carter shook his head. You don't get it, do you? His voice was quiet, almost pitying. You never even asked why you won your war against us so easily. Slithera's eyes narrowed. Why? What did he mean? You were stronger, she spat. You were faster. Your weapons outmatched us. We took your worlds in weeks. Your armies crumbled. You hid like rats. Carter smiled. But it wasn't a pleasant smile. Exactly, he said. A pulse of golden light rippled outward from Lena, spreading through the walls. The fortress shuddered violently, as if rejecting the Queen's rule. You burned our cities, Carter continued. You wiped out millions. But here's the thing, Queen. He leaned in slightly, his eyes cold and sharp. Humans don't fight wars just to win. The ground beneath them cracked open. Slithera staggered back, her warriors recoiling in terror as the fortress began to change. The walls, once pulsing with Zorveth technology, darkened, not in shadow, but in something else. The green glow of her empire faded, and something new took its place. Gold. Not just light, but something deeper, something woven into the very structure of the fortress. The Zorvath stronghold, The seat of her power was rejecting her, and it was accepting the child. Slithera refused to believe it. "You are nothing," she howled, her voice breaking. "You are weak. I watched your people kneel." Carter's gaze burned. "You watched us lose," he corrected. "You never saw what happens after." A deep, resounding hum filled the fortress. The entity, the living darkness that had stalked through the halls, tearing apart Zorvath warriors like insects, now moved toward Lena. But it did not attack. It knelt. Slithera gasped. The shadows coiled around the child, surrounding her like an ancient guardian, folding itself into the very light she emitted. It was no longer separate. It was becoming part of her. Lena exhaled slowly, and for the first time, she spoke with purpose. It was never about winning the war. Her voice, not just hers anymore. Something deeper, layered with an ancient whisper, echoed in the chamber. The fortress answered. The golden veins running through the walls flared, pulsing in rhythm with the child's breath. The very foundation of the Zorvath Empire trembled. Slithera's rage turned to panic. "No," she hissed. "No, no, no." She lunged toward the child, her claws outstretched, every instinct screaming to stop whatever was happening. And then Lena looked at her. Just looked at her, and Slithera felt the universe split open inside her mind. A flood of memories that weren't hers, echoes of voices, of places, of things that had not yet come to pass. A force beyond time, beyond logic, beyond anything the Zorvath had ever encountered. The truth hit her like a dying star. The war had never been about human resistance. The humans had been waiting. Waiting for something to wake up. Waiting for something hidden inside them to evolve. And it had. Slithera screamed. But there was no escape. The fortress collapsed inward. Not in destruction. Not in fire. But in rebirth. The Queen's empire, her home, her throne, was no longer hers. It belonged to something else now. To humanity's next step. To Lena. And the last thing Slithera saw before the golden light consumed her was Carter watching. His face calm. His voice quiet. "Big mistake, Queen." And then everything changed. Wrath unleashed. The fortress was no longer a fortress. It had become something else. A living thing, pulsing with golden veins, thrumming with power that had never belonged to the Zorvath. The walls that once stood as the seat of Slithera's empire now trembled under a force far greater than anything she had ever commanded. And at the heart of it stood Lena, the small human child, once just another prisoner, another helpless creature in the Queen's collection of broken things, was glowing. Not just with light, but with something deeper, something woven into the very fabric of reality itself. The golden aura pulsed outward from her tiny frame, stretching into the walls, into the ceiling, into the air, rewriting the very essence of the structure. Queen Slithera staggered backward, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. This wasn't right. This wasn't possible. "You are nothing," she hissed, voice trembling with rage, with fear. "You are weak. You are prey." Lena tilted her head, eyes shimmering with something ancient, something unknowable. "I was," she said softly. The floor cracked beneath them, golden fissures splitting through the alien metal. The very foundation of the Zorvath Empire was rejecting its queen, and Slithera knew this was the end. But she would not die kneeling. With a guttural roar, she lunged forward, claws extending, fangs bared, every ounce of her predatory instincts screaming to tear the child apart before whatever madness had taken hold could complete itself. She was fast, but not fast enough. Carter moved first. His hand caught her wrist mid-swipe, stopping her with ease. It was impossible. He was human. He should have been too slow, too weak, too fragile. And yet, his grip was unshakable. Slithera's golden eyes widened. Carter didn't flinch. His expression was eerily calm. "You never ask how we lost so easily," he murmured. Then, with one movement, he twisted, and snapped her wrist like dry wood. The queen screamed, stumbling back, clutching her shattered limb in disbelief. That kind of strength, it wasn't natural. But when she looked up, she saw it, the same golden glow pulsing in Carter's veins. Her breath hitched. It wasn't just the child. It was all of them. The Zorvath had made a terrible mistake. They had not conquered humanity. They had triggered something within them, something that had been waiting to awaken. And now, they were too late to stop it. The walls of the fortress exploded outward, golden energy ripping through the structure like a dying star's final breath. The Zorvath warriors screamed, their weapons useless as they were torn apart by the sheer force of the light. Outside, in the war-torn skies above the Zorvath capital, the human fleet descended. Slithera had expected ships. She had expected weapons, lasers, missiles. She had prepared for war. But this was annihilation. The human ships did not fire. They did not need to. The moment they entered the atmosphere, the same golden veins spread across them, twisting through their hulls, merging them with the storm of energy already ripping through the fortress. The Zorvath armada, so vast, so invincible, began to fall. One by one, their warships shattered in midair, their pilots screaming as their bodies disintegrated into golden dust. The once mighty fleet of conquerors burned, consumed by a force they could not fight. And at the center of it all, Lena stood, watching, not in anger, not in hatred, but in understanding. Slithera, broken, barely breathing, looked up at her in horror. You are not human," she rasped, blood spilling from her lips. "You are something else." Lena looked at her, head tilting slightly. The glow around her pulsed, softer now, calmer. "I am what you made me," she said simply. Carter stepped beside her, his gaze hard. "We gave you a chance to stop," he said. "You didn't listen." The queen's chest heaved. Her empire, her people, gone. The Zorvath, once the greatest force in the galaxy, had crumbled in a single night, and humanity had become something else. Something beyond war. Something beyond vengeance. Slithera's vision blurred. Her body failed. The last thing she saw before the golden light swallowed her whole was Lena, watching, not as a child, but as the beginning of something new. Humanity strikes back. The climax and endgame. The Zorvath Empire was no more. Where once their grand capital had stood, a city of towering black spires, their fortress of unbreakable metal, now only light remained. Golden veins wove through the ruins, creeping like roots of a new world claiming the ashes of the old. The sky above, once darkened by the mighty Zorvath armada, was clear. The vast warships that had once blotted out the stars were gone, reduced to drifting wreckage, shattered husks crumbling in the upper atmosphere. The last echoes of battle had faded, and the galaxy was watching. Across the sector, from the farthest colonies to the deepest void stations, every civilization that had feared the Zorvath, every species that had suffered under their rule, had seen the impossible unfold. The great empire that had once enslaved worlds had been erased in a single night, not by superior weapons, not by brute force, but by a single human child. Lena stood at the heart of the devastation, small and fragile, yet infinite. The golden light still shimmered around her, though it was softer now, gentler. The storm that had torn through the Zorvath had passed, but its remnants lingered, reshaping the world around her. Carter stood beside her, silent. He had fought wars, seen the worst of humanity, endured loss after loss. But this was something else. He had spent his life believing that strength was about survival, about enduring through suffering. But now he understood. True strength wasn't just surviving. It was becoming something greater. Lena looked up at him, her small hand still warm in his. "It's over," she whispered. Carter exhaled slowly. "Yeah, kid," he murmured. "It is." But deep down, He knew it wasn't. The war was over, but history had just changed forever. The price of power. The remnants of the Zorveth forces, those who had not been obliterated, those who had fled before the storm consumed them, hid in the shadows now. Scattered, broken, hunted. The mighty warriors who had once spread terror across the stars were now ghosts, lurking in the empty corners of space, their empire gone. And the galaxy's eyes had turned toward Earth. What had once been seen as a primitive world, a species meant to be conquered, was now the greatest unknown force in existence. The galactic powers, the old empires that had once ignored humanity, watched with fear and fascination. Because they did not understand. They had seen what had happened to the Zorveth. They had seen what Lena had become. And they asked themselves the question that sent fear through every ruler, every warlord, every empire still standing. Was she the only one? Or were there more like her? Lena's choice. The wreckage of the Zorvath stronghold still smoldered, but life was already beginning to claim the ruins. Strange golden vines curled around the remnants of the great palace, the tendrils growing thicker by the hour, reshaping the land into something new. Lena stepped forward, placing a small hand on the cold, cracked stone where the queen's throne had once stood. A pulse of light spread outward, sinking into the ruins. Carter frowned. "What are you doing, kid?" Lena turned back to him, her eyes no longer just brown, but flecked with gold, a reflection of something beyond human understanding. "Making sure this never happens again." The ground shifted beneath them. The ruins did not remain ruins for long. The fortress, once a place of war and cruelty, was rebuilding itself, but not as a palace of conquest. It was becoming a beacon, a monument not to the fall of the Zorveth, but to the rise of something new. Carter crossed his arms, watching her carefully. "So what now?" Lena turned her gaze toward the distant stars. The golden light around her flickered, pulsing like a heartbeat. "They'll be afraid of us," she said softly. "They'll wonder what we are, what I am." "They should be," Carter muttered. Lena smiled slightly. "Maybe. But fear isn't what makes us strong." She reached out, lifting her small hand toward the sky. The golden light stretched upward, like the first rays of a new dawn breaking across the universe. "They destroyed our worlds," she continued. "They thought they were making us weaker, but all they did was wake us up." The fortress-turned beacon hummed, its golden glow reaching beyond this world, beyond this war, sending a message across the void. Carter sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "And what's that supposed to mean?" Lena turned to him, eyes shining. "It means we're not done yet. A new age begins, far beyond the ruins, beyond the battlefield, beyond even the edges of known space." The galactic powers gathered. They whispered in hushed voices, their most powerful leaders convening in secret meetings, debating, questioning, fearing. Some called for war, a preemptive strike before humanity could grow into something unstoppable. Others called for diplomacy, a desperate plea to understand before they risked making the same mistake the Zorveth had made. And some simply watched, because they knew this was not the end of the story. This was the beginning of something new. And somewhere, hidden in the void between worlds, something else stirred. Something older than the Zorveth. Something that had been waiting far longer. And as the golden beacon on the ruins of the once great empire shone into the endless dark, a whisper traveled through the stars. "They are awake. The next war will not be fought with weapons. It will be fought with what humanity has become. And the universe is not ready."